I'm Clair Nafziger, independent researcher, and I'm going to be talking today about the benefits of infrared therapy, specifically primarily near-infrared therapy. And as well, I'll be describing what it is, how it works, and that'll be followed by a demonstration of infrared penetration into various types of tissues and substances. A lot of people are not all that familiar with infrared and its benefits, so I'll start out with that. It started in about 1967. Andre Mester, a Hungarian researcher, was trying to kill cancer cells with a laser, and instead of killing them, it turned out that he improved the wound that he had made and also hair regrowth of rats in the study that he was conducting versus a control group that didn't get the laser treatment. Now, in the early days, all of the infrared was done with lasers. Lasers were fairly new at that point in time, and it wasn't really understood how well they would work with various studies. So it turned out that the laser he had was very low powered, and that low power levels, it actually was stimulating to cell repair, cell growth. It did a lot of good things. At higher power, it was very destructive to tissue, but that was unknown. So since then, there's been thousands of studies done on the properties of near-infrared, mid-infrared, and far-infrared therapy. In about 1965, the Japanese started experimenting with far-infrared, which works via a different mechanism, and they used it primarily in saunas. Since then, they use it in all kinds of things: cooking food, warming different things, heaters, all sorts of things. So it's actually been very well researched, and surprisingly is still not that common here in the United States. It's very common in Japan, Korea, Europe. Places like that are actually quite a ways ahead of us in terms of its usage. I got interested about 10 years ago. I was having symptoms that I didn't like. Had some symptoms of chronic fatigue, and I thought, well, I'll try this infrared therapy and see if it helps. And it did help. It took quite a while. I was using more of the far infrared, which works via heat. And one of the main differences here is these work on a very short-term, quick type of treatment. When I went on PubMed, which is the huge database, literally millions of studies, almost every study ever done, and basically they have abstracts, which are sort of summaries of studies. They don't have the entire study, but you do get the vital information that way. If you want to go further and get all of the information, you have to pay, usually sometimes $70 or $80 for a single study. Anyway, they're a great source of information. So it turns out that with the near-infrared treatments, they generally lasted from 30 seconds to 3 minutes. That's just sort of a general average, although they were all over the scale in terms of how they were used, because there was a lot of experimenting going on. So these are some of the properties of the near and far infrared, and some of them are really quite exciting. The near-infrared works by lowering inflammation. It ups ATP, which is basically the energy currency of all living cells. It ups oxygen, and it increases vasodilation, which is the expansion of tiny vessels called capillaries. So these are basically properties of a lot of different diseases. And what that means is that this is helpful for a lot of different health conditions. Since Mester's studies in '67, wound healing was one of the areas that was first investigated. And probably the majority of the studies have been done on wound healing. It's also been shown helpful for joints, joint conditions, skin problems, pain, kidney disease, vision. Early on, I was using an infrared bulb, basically this one here, and I was staring into it, and I was treating myself 5 to 7 times a week for 20 minutes to half an hour. And I got worried about what that bright light might be doing to my eyesight. And after a couple of years of doing that, I went into an optometrist, had an exam, found out that my eyesight had improved a bit. And most recently I went in again 5 years after that. Turned out that my eyesight had again improved. The optometrist said a small amount, but definitely improvement. Well, that's exciting when you're someone my age to find out that your eyesight can actually gradually improve over time. So I'm not too worried about damage to vision. The one issue is that some of these are so bright that they're quite uncomfortable. And so you'll need to either turn down the power a bit or use sunglasses just for comfort. Now, I think that a couple of really fascinating areas are sports performance. Near-infrared was used by the Nike project, the Olympic team, quite a number of professional football teams. It's been shown to reduce damage done post-exercise, and it's also shown to increase performance a bit. Now, on all of these, it's not necessarily a cure, but it improves those conditions. I think possibly the most exciting work of all was done by Professor Lou Lim at the University of Toronto. He's been working with a near-infrared emitter that he designed called the V-Light, and he uses it on people's heads. And to penetrate the skull better, he puts it up people's noses so that it gets access to the brain better. And he's found that he can halt the progression of both Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, which is phenomenal. There's no drug that can do that, and also actually reverse it a bit. Now, this works via something called chromophores in the body, and that's gets pretty technical. It has to do with cytochrome C oxidase, which is an enzyme that actually unites little tiny electrons with oxygen. It's the final stage in the mitochondria. And they're also found in hemoglobin, which it basically stimulates hemoglobin to drop off oxygen. Those are another chromophore. The final one is melanin, and melanin is in the skin. Unfortunately, the more that's absorbed in the skin, the more the power of the infrared or penetration is blocked, and that's not a good thing. So it turns out that dark-skinned people absorb, the deep absorption is quite a bit less, and they found out that a higher wavelength works better for those people up around 1080. The mid and far infrared work on an entirely different mechanism. They work by basically agitating water molecules in the body, and since the body is over 70% water, they absorb a great deal at the longer wavelengths. The mechanism there is heat shock proteins, which are a protein that's kind of a chaperone protein in the body, and they basically coax other proteins within the cell back into a more healthy shape, because those proteins tend to lose their shape over time. Also, the FOXO3 genetic pathway, that's a very powerful kind of a master gene that has to do with longevity, repairing damage to the DNA, a very powerful pathway. Ups immune function, again, DNA repair. It's heart disease, longevity, pain, all-cause death. A very fascinating study was done by Jari Lukonen, a researcher and doctor in Finland, and he did a study of 20 years length with men aged 50 to 65. And what he found was really quite phenomenal. There was a decrease in overall mortality of the people of these 2,000 men in this group of 40%. There was a 48% decrease in fatal cardiac events, and there was a 65% decrease in both Alzheimer's and dementia. So these are incredibly powerful findings, really almost mind-boggling. And if this therapy is done correctly, there's no side effects. It's not like a lot of pharmaceutical drugs with many side effects. So it's a very interesting and powerful new therapy. Now, when people ask about infrared, they want to know what it is. And so basically, infrared is part of the electromagnetic spectrum. That sounds a little intimidating, but it's actually photons. And depending on their wavelength, they have entirely different properties. In the very short waves, very tiny, why they're very hot and very penetrating and quite damaging to cells and molecules. And these are known as gamma rays, X-rays. As we go in this direction, the waves get longer and longer. Over here we have ultraviolet. Actually the B and the A ultraviolet are healthy in the right amounts. This promotes vitamin D uptake, and this promotes tanning. Then we get to visible light, which is a very narrow spectrum of the entire electromagnetic spectrum. And that's what we mostly think of when we talk about light. Technically, the whole electromagnetic spectrum is radiation, which most people think of as harmful, but there's actually all types of radiation in this spectrum, which include the infrared here, which is next to visible light, microwaves, and finally radio waves. So that's basically what it is. That to keep in mind, it's very important how long the waves are. These little photons that travel as individual little packets also travel in waves, and the properties can vary all the way from X-rays to radio waves. Now, when we get down to the near-infrared spectrum, we're getting to a spectrum that's very, very powerful. We get more energy from the sun in the near-infrared spectrum than any other part, and that's followed by visible light. Over half of the energy we get from the sun is in this little tiny, narrow, near-infrared region. It's basically what's now called photobiomodulation. It started out in the early days, since all of the research with near-infrared was done with lasers. It was called low-level laser therapy, and then it became low-level light therapy, and eventually it became photobiomodulation is now the modern term for it. And the industry also went through a kind of a change. Early on, all of the lasers it was basically just lasers that were used, but they were quite expensive, and they covered a really tiny area. So let's say you were addressing a torn quadriceps. You would have to move very, very slowly over that part of the leg to cover all of the injured area. So that led to the advent of LEDs, and they're somewhat different. But anyway, I'm going to demonstrate with a laser here. This is one of the more powerful ones. It's 1,000 milliwatts. That makes it a class 4 laser, which can cause damage. A couple of seconds of looking into the light can damage your eyesight. It also turns out that there's very much a sweet spot in this therapy where too little is not good and too much is bad. So, and that's called the biphasic dose response. It's called the Arndt-Schultz curve. A lot of things, but the thing to remember is it just means too little is not effective and too much is either not helpful or harmful even. So anyway, the limitations with the laser are that it has to be done at a very close distance. It's very hard to cover a large area. So that's basically led to the use of LEDs. Now, light from the sun covers a broad spectrum. It covers the whole electromagnetic spectrum. And basically, light from a laser just throws out one single wavelength. Generally, they'll center around 800, 810, but it varies. And there's also a little tiny sliver in the red light section that is very similar to the effects in this range. However, the red light in studies has been shown to not penetrate at best, more than about 13 millimeters, which is just over half an inch. where this can go quite a bit deeper, and I'll be demonstrating that. So basically, again, this works here through stimulating chromophores. This works through heat. The middle infrared region is called the thermal region, and it's the hottest by far, and then followed by the far infrared in progressively lower levels of heat. But heat is the driver here in this type of therapy. Now, I'm going to talk just a little bit more about broadband versus the very narrow wavelength of the laser. The laser just throws out one single wavelength. Now the LEDs are a bit different. They throw out, for instance, if we're talking about an 800 nanometer wavelength, the laser will just throw out an 800. The LEDs throw out a band about 20 nanometers wide, and that. In other words, that band would be about from 790 to 810 in width. Still very narrow bandwidth. Now I'm going to read a couple of quotes here. This one's from Michael Hamblin. He's probably the most prominent researcher of near-infrared therapy in America. He notes that all wavelengths in the 800 to 900 wavelengths range, plus 660 in the red light spectrum, have health benefits. And this is from the National Center for Biotech Information. Shining wavelengths of 880, 1064, 1072, and broadband infrared light have all been reported to carry out photobiomodulation effects. The Journal of Regenerative Medicine, this is a quote from them, it suggests that simultaneous multiple wavelengths illumination are more effective than single wavelengths. Also, when used on different animal models, in vitro and clinically, wound healing is induced by many different wavelengths. So, basically what we're looking at here is the LED lights. The red lights throw out a very tiny little sliver of light that actually is not found in nature. So this is a totally new experience to cells, organisms, getting this very narrow slice of light instead of a more broadband light from the sun. So at this point, I'm going to quit lecturing here and demonstrate how these various types of mechanisms, how deeply they penetrate into human tissue. You done?